Network and WISE. We hope to have many more events like this, and I'm very excited for the content of tonight's presentation and for the opportunity to meet with all of you. So thank you for taking the time and making your way to SLO. I know it's a bit of a maze to get around, so thank you for your patience there. And if you need restrooms, they're out the door and around the corner to the left. And if you have any other questions about MIT or our initiative, or just want to say hi after the panel, I'm very happy to meet you and to get to know you.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Smith. I'm one of the co-leaders of WISE Boston, along with Lindsay White and Kathleen Cole. Just want to wave hello. So WISE is a global network of women that are contributing to the ESG industry. It was started in 2012 in New York, and now we've grown to 7 chapters throughout the country, and we're also in London and Toronto, which is really exciting. The Boston chapter was formed about 5 years ago, and we've grown to a little over 400 members as of last month, which is very exciting. And really looking forward to this event with IEN and hearing from the panelists. Just to give a quick, I think everyone should introduce themselves, but just quickly, we have Eric Gross, who is the treasurer of the UNH Foundation. Fiona Wilson, the executive director for the Center of Social Innovation and Enterprise for UNH. Alexis Gilkins, an alumna of UNH, and Kate Dumas, principal consultant from Prime Buckles, and Alice Anaselva, principal from the Intentional Endowments Network. Thank you, everyone. And over to Alice.
Hi, everybody. I'm managing director at Intentional Endowments Network. We work with higher education endowments mostly, but also other endowments and foundations to help them align their investments in their endowments with their mission as a school. So what we have, about 5 years ago, we formed with our first meeting actually in Cambridge in 2014 April. At the request of some schools who knew Tony Cortese, who's our founder, and George Dyer, who had been working for many years in higher education. Students that came to them, administrators came to them because students had come to them around fossil fuel investment, and they weren't sure how to proceed, how to answer their questions, how to think about the problem. And so we held our first forum in April 2014. That was 5 years ago, shortly after Intentional Endowments Network was formed, because we found that it was really beneficial to those administrators, trustees, sustainability directors, faculty, and students to be able to have a conversation in a common room in a safe space. So we've grown from about, I think, 75 to 70, somewhere around 75 members when we started, founding members up to about 160 right now. And one of the questions that we found, or one of the things that struck me when we did the first forum, my relationship with at Prime Buckles at the time, and was working with Hampshire College, and they asked me to come speak. And what struck me is that the endowment professionals, who I felt like had sort of control and responsibility of the assets, were very tentative and felt like the decision was made by somebody else and weren't sure where to start. So many times in the past couple of years, we got asked for a roadmap. And so hence the title of this, we're going to talk about UNH's story in context of the roadmap. But the roadmap is something that we created based on what we see many schools go through, the process we see them go through. And it's a living document, so UNH helps us test out whether it actually is that's the way it works for them. And so I'm going to attempt to forward this and see if it works. So here's our roadmap. We find that most universities there's a learning phase. It's not, many of them come to us and say, oh, we can't overturn our portfolio overnight. And no one does that. They all have fiduciary duty. They don't turn their portfolio overnight. So the first step is to learn about sustainable capital markets, sustainable investing, what their opportunities are. And then once we've gone through a learning process, sometimes that involves the whole campus community. Sometimes there's some subset, like the ESG advisory committee. The next step is to build consensus around that and talking about here, the stories here, talking about conversations with the investment committee through those advisory committees. So that once that's all done, we kind of move towards, I think, the story might be a little different here, but we move towards establishing the next step is then you start aligning your portfolio. You assess what's in there, whether it fits with your mission in the way that you want it to. You align and then you monitor, and that's an iterative process. So as that's going on, you may learn more about sustainable investing, and more investments may come to your attention. So that goes back. You learn a little more. You might build some more consensus. Yeah. And today we're really experiencing the community out part. So it's really essential, and we're so grateful to UNH for being willing to communicate their story. So it's essential that they share what they have learned to make it easier for other endowments. So with that, I think we've already had everyone introduced, so I'm going to just join the panel. So the first question I have is really for Eric and Fiona to kick it off with. Every university and college starts with doing this in the context of their own experience and history and goals as a university. So Eric, if you can start us off and then maybe lead over to Fiona and telling us how this fits within the context of your history.
Sure. It's great to be here. We've told the story a couple different times, a couple different ways and venues. So this is great to be able to do it again and with different people on the panel to help relate the various factors that really have played in UNH. So UNH has a very strong sustainability ethic to it that's been in place for a long time, and I'll let Fiona talk a little bit later about that. She can provide much more in-depth detail on that. Our foray into sustainable investing really started with conversations initiated by students at UNH. We had a couple different groups, the Divest UNH students who were interested in getting UNH to divest from investments. And then there's another group that is called Net Impact, and they were really helpful. These two groups were really helpful together to provide a counter sort of different perspectives to the people that they were communicating with, which for us was the foundation board, our investment committee, leaders at UNH, president of UNH and others. And so Divest UNH had one perspective, very focused on fossil fuel divestment. Net Impact was really much more interested in more of an ESG, sort of a more holistic approach to having sustainable investing, not necessarily exclusionary investing. So they did some research. Some of them wrote a paper and presented it to our foundation board. So our foundation board was involved in the learning part of this process, as was everybody else at that time, which started back in 2012. And continued for a couple years, really. So there was a lot of conversation. There were, I would call them like town meetings, as it were. There was the New Hampshire Listens project, which I remember convened more than 100 people from the community at UNH to talk about this topic in good detail. So that was really the learning part and trying to get to a point where we could build consensus. And so that took a long time, and it was very iterative, back and forth, a lot of discussion. The Foundation Investment Committee, not particularly receptive at the time for the investment conversation, but willing to listen to the students, which was really important, and that has developed and evolved over time over the last several years with membership on that investment committee changing. And so eventually what happened was there was a decision at the foundation board level to set up a separate investment option, or what they called at the time the ESG. And so that was really the culmination of all those conversations over the course of a couple of years. We, in many ways, skipped past the investment policy because we had an existing investment policy. We had a over $150 million investment at that time that was governed by an investment policy. UNH views, I would say that the foundation views its investment policy as a tool to reflect our current operations, to guide what we're doing also, but to reflect. So it's it's a malleable document, and it's not something that people necessarily fall back on and say, but it's not in the investment policy, so we're not going to do it. So there's definitely an openness, and that openness has increased over time with the investment committee. The maintaining that dialogue, and just going, sort of looping back again and again and again to the learning and building consensus. We established the sleeve and actually were able to create a $1 million investment pool focused on ESG investing. Relative to the rest of our investments, very small. And we weren't able to do what we can do with our main portfolio. It wasn't at the time a fully diversified portfolio. It was very simple sort of 80-20 equity-based income approach. And I want to mention Kate from Prime Buckles. Prime Buckles was incredibly instrumental in all of this along the way, in terms of helping the conversation flow and providing feedback and information about fossil fuel exposure in the main portfolio, and just being very facilitating in terms of the data that's available. So I think I'll stop there. I know there's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just, before we turn it over to Fiona to tell her part of the history, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of sustainability at UNH, and it seems like it's a core theme to both of you. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think the piece I'd love to share, how many of you are involved in sort of, as alumni in your universities that you studied? Quite a lot of you. Yeah, great. And I think that that would be something I would love to you to take away as a part of this message, is that this is replicable, and that a lot of this energy is coming from students, but also from alums. So you have voice as alums. So just to back up a little bit about UNH, we are the state flagship public university in New Hampshire. We've been around for 150 years, and as a flagship state university, we're what we call a land grant university, also a sea and space grant university. So our mission is very much about the public good, right? Going back to our founding 150 years ago, that's sort of in our DNA. It's about serving the community and doing things that are for the public good. I think a lot of people don't know this because we're sort of tucked away in the fields of New Hampshire, but we're actually the second most sustainable university in the country. It's something we're really proud of. Today, some of you may have heard of ASHE, the association that works with colleges and universities to rank universities on their sustainability. So we have the second highest stars score in the country. We're one of only 5 universities now that have platinum level of stars. If you know about sort of LEED for buildings, ASHE stars is sort of equal to LEED for buildings. But it really assesses the whole of the university. So it's not just about our buildings and our operations, it's also about our curriculum and the research that we do. So it's really looking at, is this a university that's embedding sustainability principles into its DNA? We're also Sierra Club's #2 cool school. But that leadership we have in the country today didn't just happen overnight. It was really built on 25 years of foundation. We started the Sustainability Institute 20 years ago now. We were the first endowed Institute of Sustainability in higher education in the country. So it's been a long time in building. But when, as we think about this, right, and you probably know this because you're all part of WISE, our students, this generation, care deeply about social and environmental impact. And so increasingly, students are coming to UNH because we're a leader in sustainability. And they are demanding new things and are interested in the way that our university is operating. And I think for us, when we thought about our leadership in sustainability, we do a lot of amazing things around energy, do fantastic research in sustainability, but our investment of our endowment was sort of a glaring gap. And So we wanted to remedy that, not just because it's an important thing to do, but because we see the university as being an incredible learning tool, right? We want to practice what we preach, and we want to use all of the things that we do at UNH as sort of living learning laboratory for students to be able to see what the sustainability look like in action. So for us, it was a very natural progression to want to align our endowment with our sustainability profile and values.
So Derek mentioned that this started a little bit, or there was some pressure from the students around fossil fuel divestment. So you went through a learning curve, I think, of learning and building consensus, and came out with a sort of different approach. And so I wonder if each of you could put together your story about it. I don't know if you want to start again with Fiona to launch it off, or and just talk about how you went from sort of this conversation about fossil fuel divestment to a conversation about integrating ESG and building this ESG investment.
So it's sort of interesting that I think this work, you have to be sort of pretty ambitious and sort of have a sense of where this can go, but also be sort of radically patient, right? Because this stuff takes a lot of time, especially in the context of how a university works. So it was really about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, that the Divest, there was a group of students who were calling for divestment. Just in full transparency, I was advising a different group who was interested in ESG investing. And I was actually thinking about the story last night. So it was really started by a student who did a summer internship with Pax World in Portsmouth, which is one of the leaders in ESG investing, you probably know. And he was a pretty classic finance kid, right? He hadn't thought a lot about ESG or what that was or why it mattered, and went and spent the summer working with Pax World and learned a lot about ESG, and sort of came back as a sort of a convert and a champion. And so he recruited another couple of students that were in the Net Impact organization with him. And they spent about 9 months doing a pretty extensive research project looking at ESG and how the field was progressing, but they also looked at other universities to understand what other universities were doing around ESG and divestment. And ended up making a presentation about 9 months later at our university's undergraduate research conference, and that put in motion some of these things. It really led to that first decision that Eric mentioned to create sustainability sleep. So it was a really important part of changing hearts and minds, right? Eric's predecessor was invited. We invited members of the Investment and Finance Committee, members of the Board of Trustees, President, Provost, and it was at the time, there was a lot of resistance to divestment, and so we were trying to position this as a very viable alternative to allow the university to align its values with its investments. And, it was, a small win, I think, from there, but it was really pivotal in setting some of this in motion.
We had also one of our investment committee members, current chair of our he committed some funds. He was a major donor, and he committed some funds to the ESG option. So he was really the founding donor of this. So he sort of solidified it in reality. Before that, it was theoretical. And then sometime later, there was another donor who had actually made a large donation to the Sustainability Institute, and he directed us to put his money into this new ESG sleeve. So with that, we were actually able to turn that into a real portfolio. So that was another key element that really allowed this to happen, and really make sure that the ESG approach is the one that we follow going forward.
Alexis, you're an alum, and you were on the Committee on Investor Responsibility. So maybe you can talk about how that committee played into this whole learning and building consensus and conversations with the investment community.
So thanks for having me, everybody. Thanks for being here. So my story really started with the CIR when I was a senior at UNH. I was invited to be part of the committee because of my role in an investment group at UNH. So the investment group does not focus specifically on sustainable investing, but we actually, not yet, that's right. We have had alums in the past that have really tried to change the way that we think about investing what is now about $280,000 in assets, one of which sits on our committee as an alum as well. He's not here today, but what was really important to me is that I knew what UNH was doing in the sustainable space, and I saw it from a student perspective. I saw what we do in our lunchrooms, and I saw all of the awards and the conversations that we were having from the student side of things, but I didn't necessarily know how, from the top, from an endowment perspective, what that conversation looks like. So what was really important to me was that I got to get together every 2 months, and I got to have that conversation, and I got to bring that student perspective. And then, beyond that, bring that conversation back to other students. So I, at the time, had just finished off a presidency of the investment group I was speaking of, and I sat back and asked myself, why do we not have an ESG-focused sector? Why don't we look at ESG ratings for our company? Why is this not part of our conversation every Tuesday and Thursday when we're getting together as 42 students to invest that much money? And again, things move a little bit slowly. You have to be incredibly patient, but the first step is always starting that conversation, learning, right? Being able to go back to this investment group and say to my peers, I think we should do this, and here's why. So I'm very thankful for what the community taught me, and I think it's been really nice to see how that conversation on campus has changed. I recently was on the phone with actually a student in that group Tuesday, and he said, one thing we're doing this year is we're really interested in learning about how our companies rate from an ESG perspective and what they're doing to be sustainable. And I went, really? That's really great to hear, because that's not a narrative that in the past was the first thing that somebody brought up to me. And he at the time didn't know that I sat on this committee, so he was just genuinely very interested in this. So the conversation just continues to get better and better on campus, and now even as an alum, I still get to have that conversation. So it's really great.
You sit on the committee as an alum.
Yes, now as an alum. Yep. So I was on it as a senior, and
Yeah, we wouldn't let her go. And I want to bring Kate into the conversation, and we'll come back to that committee, because I think talking about the makeup is important also. But Kate's been working as a consultant to Brian Buckholz with the university for some time. And I remember when I was still there having conversations with what was going on at UNH. So bring your perspective of learning. I know you mentioned an important meeting along the way, and maybe bring that into the...
Absolutely. So I work for Prime Buckholz. We're an investment consulting firm, and we work with institutions to invest their assets. And the way to think about that is really kind of trying to get together with a group of diverse individuals and take into account, their financial picture and their debt covenants and the dynamics around the table, and weave that into some sort of portfolio that's reflective of the institution. It was a very similar kind of process that brought us to where we did with New Hampshire. So in a very similar way, all of these conversations were kind of happening, and myself and my colleagues were there for the DevFest UNH conversations and the forming of the Committee on Investor Responsibility, and also at the investment committee. So there are a lot of these dialogues that are happening, and at that point in time, we were building our knowledge as well. And so the conversations I had with Alice were around, here's kind of where we are, and here's what we're thinking about. And we've put together, a little over $1 million to put together a small suite. How are we going to approach that? And so it was just a really great kind of to be involved all the way along the way, but to have a framework from the investment side that we could apply on this front, where we were really kind of building that information, trying to help articulate and guide and look for opportunities that were actually investable. And that was another key component here. you can have a million wonderful ideas about how you want to have impact, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to allocate dollars to those ideas. And so that was really, for me, a critical component. And we kind of had all the pieces in place. And so when the conversation really kind of finally came to a head, and we had the Committee for Investor Responsibility as well as the Investment Committee, we were also on site for a regular investment committee meeting in Boston in January of 2018. And that was the moment where everything really solidified. Maybe I'll pass it back to Eric to kind of, or actually,
Sure.
maybe Alexis, you can talk about the 3 proposals that were brought forward. And
Yeah.
The proposals that we went.
Yeah.
Came out
Right.
with.
So in January, our investment committee met actually down here in Boston,
Yeah.
right?
Wait, where's that?
A year and a half ago. So 2000, I know. So the Committee on Investor Responsibility, let me back up just a little bit. The committee was formed back in June of 2017. So about 18 months before this January, no, about 6 months before this January meeting, hard to believe. And so spent the 6 months educating ourselves. The committee, I should say, is made up of investment committee member as a liaison, myself as sort of a staff support, 3 faculty members, some students. We had 2 or 3 at the time, some alums, and yes, yeah. So it was like 11 or 12. Yeah, right, and then industry friends, well-placed. So that 6 months after formation until we actually made the presentation was all about just getting to know each other and understanding the whole framework as a team, and then saying, okay, we need to work ourselves forward to being able to make a proposal of some sort. So we ended up coming forward with 4 proposals. This was really the first time the committee had come in front of the investment committee, and so made 4 proposals, 2 of which were pretty straightforward. They were non-financial proposals. One was to join IEN. Another one was to become a signatory with the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI. Both of those were approved. And then the other 2 were more substantive in terms of the portfolio. The big one was to ask the investment committee to put an ESG overlay on top of the entire portfolio. That was sort of the big ask, right? That was not approved
At that time.
Hopefully someday we'll get there, but again, that was the big ask. And then there was a third one, which why don't I let you talk about the third one?
About
The 37.
about the.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know
It's
how
okay.
much we can share. So we, again, this is a group of us, I think it was 4, that were, at this time that were joining the finance committee that serves our foundation board. And we brought an array of, there was an alum at the time, I was a student at the time, and then Eric joined us, Kate joined us, Fiona. So, and Julie, yes, we kind of brought a team. And the fourth ask was we wanted to move $37 million of our current endowment into the ESG sleeve. And these had come from separate, we already had the money. It had come from, at the time, was sitting in separate spots. But our ask was, we feel as though these funds and the people that donated these funds in some ways align with our sleeve, our ESG sleeve, and what the committee believes to be aligned in those senses. And we want to move this money. And that was, we saved it for last. And that was a big one. And I think at that time, from a student perspective, I didn't really know what to expect in terms of the feedback that we were going to get. But I knew that I wanted to be incredibly open-minded about having this conversation, and I wanted the people, because I wanted the people that were there to be open-minded about our request. So I thought that that was very important, and I knew that maybe there were some people that were still in that learning process. I wanted to give them the opportunity to try and best understand why we were making this ask, rather than necessarily just going in with an opinion about it and sticking to that. So we approached that conversation very open-minded, I would think, and we listened. At the same time, we had a lot of wonderful people in the room that were willing to vouch for the committee and the proposals that the committee was making, one of which, as Eric mentioned, sits on our committee and also sits within the investment committee for the foundation board. So that was really important, was to have somebody that was willing to stand next to us, as well as next to the people that we were presenting to and asking to make this big change. And we also had a lot of other stakeholders at the university that supported having this conversation. So at this time, that fourth ask to move those funds,
We're done.
It's done.
It's done.
It's done.
That's the next piece.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Which again, this is back to the learning process. You have to, it takes some time to make these moves. But overall, I think a key takeaway from that meeting, from a student perspective, again, I talked about how when I joined this committee, I didn't know what the tone from the top, so to speak, was. So it was important for me that I understood how to have these conversations, which frankly are not easy conversations to have, and that's something that I brought with me to my career as well. When you're sitting across from the table with somebody and you don't necessarily think that they're going to immediately agree, or there might be some opposition, you have to be very open-minded about that, and you have to listen to each other, because you won't be listened to if you can't provide that as well. So it was a great learning experience as a student. It was really nice to go home and say, okay, this is what we did, this is awesome, as well as to go back to our committee and say, how do we approach this differently the next time? Because that, again, that third component was not proved at the time, and we will be going back with that. But I think overall, great conversation. Really, as Kate mentioned, this is really where everything sort of came together for us in some years of work from that point.
And I think I should add the reason why the conversation it was a really interesting conversation, and there was people at different points. Some people really just didn't want to do it. They were skeptical, and appropriately so. They're fiduciaries of the university's endowment. And this was 18 months ago. There was, even at that time, less information about the viability, the return viability of an ESG approach. Right? There's been a lot more publication on that and research. So they were unwilling to go all in, but they understood, ultimately they understood that these investments, these endowed funds, three of which support the Sustainability Institute, and one of which was very strongly towards governance and improving governance in New Hampshire, actually, really belonged within the ESG investment sleeve. That was really not the question. The question was, can we do this in a way that's not going to impact returns negatively, right? That's the big question. And so they were, the people in the room, Prime Buchholz, and Ned, our investment committee chair, and others were able to, and then finally, President Huddleston.
Yes.
Finally, the president of the University of New Hampshire really brought it all home, because the conversation was just all over the map.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of opinions. And then he brought it home, and he really coalesced the ask into something that made sense to everybody, and was really hard to deny. Any other thoughts?
So as you think about that, the natural question with a bunch of producers around the table is, can we do this? And how are we going to do this? And so it was interesting. Alice was one of the founding members, along with myself and a couple other folks, of our, what we called at the time, the SRI task force. Now it's called our Mission Aligned Investment Committee. But a little over a decade ago, we were starting to see a real shift in the asset management industry. And so whereas, we work predominantly with not-for-profit, so 90% of our clients, maybe more, have mission. That's part of what they're doing. And so across the board, every single one of our clients has some sort of mission or value. And at this stage, it's really just a question of how they want to implement that. And so we have this kind of team that's been put in place that leverages not only our kind of client framework, but also our research platform. It was built and we were ready to go. And we have a number of clients who had already moved down that threshold. Alex talked about Hampshire College, for example. This was an opportunity to kind of say, we can do this. This is a large piece of your endowment that's going to be moving over to ESG. We've given you a portfolio that's worked over the past couple of years at $1 million to actually, I think it's 2.5. Yeah, by the time we moved the funds over. Here's a 3-step plan for how we're going to get this done over the next 12 months. And it was interesting because I think at that point in time, you could see where we were going from a portfolio, as Eric mentioned, that was just equities and fixed income, to be able to really kind of diversify. And so we were able to add some really interesting active managers on the equity space. The same thing in fixed income. We were able to add a real estate manager that's a little bit more environmentally focused. We were able to add hedge funds. There's not a great universe of hedge funds that are operating sustainably with integrity, but there were options. And so all of a sudden we're talking to these fiduciaries about a portfolio that looks very much in characteristic to the main portfolio. And it's very comparable in its risk characteristics. And so I think right there it was a nice opportunity to kind of say, yes, we've got this, we can build it. There's one manager in the endowment portfolio, and I don't know if any of you follow the asset management industry. Their returns have, over the last 10 years, exceeded their benchmark by 3%. That's unheard of. So you have that in the legacy portfolio, and the question is, how are we going to take those funds and move them to this ESG portfolio where, we don't know if there's a restriction. We showed them a fund that over the last 10 years had outperformed a broad benchmark by 400 basis points that is built on sustainability. And so it was those kind of conversations. It was a lot of work that we did with the committee. We had a conversation with every single manager we put into the portfolio. Ultimately, we added 9 firms, 10 funds, and today, granted, the portfolio, the last tranche got invested in January of 2019, so it is all done. The portfolio is fully built, and knock on wood, it's keeping pace to outperforming the portfolio.
So that's great, and I think that we've already answered some questions about assessment. So that those managers get assessed the same way that other managers that Prime Health recommends get assessed. Same sort of diligence process. Maybe a little more focus on what they're doing around using environmental and social and governance factors to make their investment decisions, but the same sort of proving out there you have a thesis on that. I think we've touched on that. I think and you touched on how the decisions are made for the ESG pool. Eric, you had mentioned that the UNH already had an investment policy statement, but I think when we spoke, we talked about adding some language. I think there may have been language even added at the beginning. So just talk about that a little bit.
We added some pretty soft language into the investment portfolio, into the investment policy statement. When we were going through the STARS process, which was leading up to the summer of 2017. And so in order to, we were catalyzed, that's not the right word, but we were catalyzed to do some things through the STARS process. One, to set up this committee on investor responsibility. Okay. The next one was to consider, and this was hard, but to consider full disclosure on our website of all of our holdings. Our investment committee up until that point was really reluctant to let anybody know what they were doing at all, right? But we got to the point of ultimately that we were able to do that, and I can tell you that not one a single inquiry. Not one. Now, I don't know if that's because we have such a great portfolio, or if people just really don't care. But in terms of the investment policy statement, we wanted to get a third of a point in the STARS process by really making it a little more explicit about ESG. So we added some language that the committee will include ESG factors in its consideration and monitoring of its investments. All the investments, not just the ESG. So that was a little improvement. And then we just held back on making any other changes until we were done with the full portfolio transition that has brought us up to now 40 million. Now we feel like we're at a point where we have to reflect in our investment policy statement not exactly the same asset allocation. So we've just got two different tables, one for the main pool, one for the ESG pool. The asset allocations, they're a little different. Their targets are a little different, their ranges are a little different. So we're almost to the point where we're actually approving that with the investment committee. But as I said before, we're not using nobody has been using the investment policy to pound the table. We're really just using it to reflect our operation, the way that we're conducting our business. In case anybody wants to know, or in case somebody needs to be reminded, we haven't had that situation, but in case anybody needs to be reminded, this is what we said we were supposed to do. And front and center in all of that, of course, the policy statement is maximizing the returns, because that's the responsibility of the fiduciaries of the portfolio, is to make sure that we get the best possible return we can with an appropriate level of risk, and that we're not sacrificing any of that. And our investment committee is willing to take some time and let the ESG pool work through a year, 2, 3, 4 years, really see what the experience is. And they're confident, and Prime has helped make them confident, that it's not going to be dramatically different from our main pool. So that's what we're counting on. And everybody's on board with that. So.
Is that pool subject to the same spending requirements as the rest of them?
Exactly the same.
Exactly the
Yeah,
same.
so even though we've moved those 4 funds over from the main to the ESG, it's exactly the same endowment payout. Everything is the same. It's just that the vehicles they're invested in are different.
And so ongoing now, is the investment committee responsible for the whole foundation is responsible for oversight of this pool as well?
Yes.
Correct?
Yep.
And then how does the Committee on Investor Responsibility work with that? Are you still making suggestions or working through kind of buckles, or how does that all work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Committee,
Yeah.
It is ongoing and iterative, so we had the roadmap before and it kind of comes around. It's an ongoing conversation, and I think it's very much, the Committee on Investor Responsibility. I was hearing about some of the upcoming ideas on the drive down, and I'm really excited to kind of see those land with the committee. But it's really on our end just incumbent to be ready for those things, and how can we support that, and how can we make that, investable in the portfolio.
I would say that we're being recorded, right? I don't know whether it was by luck or by judgment, but the Committee on Investor Responsibility is definitely populated with people who are advocates for ESG. So, one of our committee members is a leading climate scientist, right? He has a point of view. One of our committee members is a leading ethicist. He definitely has a point of view. If I teach sustainable business, I have a point of view. So I think you can have committees that sort of exist to say we have a committee, and then you can have committees who decide that they are going to use the committee to advance how the endowment reflects our mission as a university. So I would say we're definitely in that mode, which is we are really proud of what we've accomplished, and we are incredibly ambitious about where we want to go next. So the committee is not sort of saying, check the box, we've moved 20% of our endowment into ESG. we just see that as the beginning, so.
It's great that you have investment committee representation on there and you as the
Yes.
treasurer on there as well. I think that's a good perspective.
I might add for everybody's knowledge, the committee has two primary purposes. The committee's purposes are to educate and to advise. So advise the investment and finance committee, but also educate, broadly defined, anybody, right? And so educate the investment finance committee because they recognize that they need to learn more about sustainable investing. Educate our own UNH local constituencies, and then also educate others outside of UNH. So we're always looking for opportunities to do that within the availability of time and resources.
Just to add to that too, we meet for an hour and a half every other month, and we never get through as much as we want to get through because there's just so much. We have so many. I mean, and not to pat ourselves on the back, but we have great ideas, and I think that we really want to make an impact at UNH, and some of the ways that we've tried to do that is, beyond speaking with the foundation board, we're speaking with students. We're setting up panels that haven't been set up in the past that are focused mainly on having this discussion about ESG and sustainable investing, which is then I was speaking of that student that came back to me and said, this is what we're looking at. I think those are all driven off of making this conversation a very common conversation on campus. And we do have hopefully some ideas in the future of ways that we can continue that. But the committee just doesn't really stop. So.
But it's wonderful to hear you all just answer like the next 4 questions. So I want to talk a little bit, let's lead into that future events and future communication. So we're really in the communication process, though the investment process still keeps going. And I want to talk a little bit about the future plans for UNH and thoughts about the continuing communication out within in the community, in the campus community, and also outside.
We had a CIR conference call earlier this week, so
It's all top of mind.
we can all talk about these things. Fiona and I have met with a couple finance faculty members at UNH College and talked about how to the extent that sustainable investing is even part of the conversation in the curriculum. And so we're looking at ways to help support the enhancement of the finance curriculum in the area of sustainable investing. A lot of people really simply don't know a lot about this. And so there's a lot of opportunity to increase the conversation. So that's one idea. Another idea, that is really hopeful, but we don't know if it will actually stick. Is the idea of carving out a small piece of our ESG pool and handing it over in a way to the students to invest alongside their already existing student investment pool. So we have one that's a non-constrained investment pool, and then we have another that's an ESG informed investment pool. And we view this as having so many possibilities for so many opportunities for growing, for learning, with faculty, with students, connections with foundation investment committee members and the college business, and on and on. So that's an opportunity. We'll see if that one actually can come to fruition.
I think we're very ambitious about wanting to eventually get to the point where we can go all in 100% of our endowments and ESG criteria. I think we have learned in this process about the process it takes to get there. And I think we're trying to be very mindful that we do this in a way, we don't want to go back with that same recommendation, 18 months later and get it shot down again, right? That's sort of the definition of insanity, right? Just going back and doing the same thing and hoping for a different outcome. And so we've been trying to think very carefully about how do we make incremental steps towards that longer term goal. So I think one of the one of the recommendations we're going to be making soon is around all new money that comes into the endowment, that the default would be to ESG. So unless a donor really had a violent objection to it, the default would be ESG. Hopefully will be a palatable step in the right direction.
So I'm going to ask Kate too on the communication front, how this works back at the time about how your work with UNH has informed your colleagues and you and how you bring that communication back.
So this is a great case study, as you're hearing. And this is kind of in practice, we were talking about, for me, I'm like, over the course of the year, we just got the portfolio invested, but it is that whole conversation that took place all the way through. And it's